She came in for a job interview, quiet, composed, with a 6-year-old girl holding her hand. The receptionist hesitated. Upstairs. The CEO glanced at the name on the schedule, then froze. No one had told him he had a daughter, but the look in the child's eyes. That wasn't something you could fake. Something about this day didn't feel routine anymore. If you believe that silence sometimes hides the biggest truths, stay with us. And if this story stirs something in you, like, subscribe, or leave a thought, it matters more than you know. It was 8:47 a.m. on a wet March morning in downtown Chicago when Grace Mitchell stepped into the marble lobby of Callahan Group Tower, her left hand holding her daughter's, her right gripping a wrinkled manila folder. The child beside her, Lily, 6 years old, missing one front tooth and carrying a faded unicorn backpack, skipped slightly as she walked, boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Everyone else in the lobby wore dark coats and hard shoes and didn't seem to notice them at first. The tower was all glass and chrome and stillness. Security officers flanked the revolving doors like statues, while the receptionist desk glowed behind a sleek granite counter. There was no music playing, no buzz of small talk. It wasn't that kind of place. It was the kind of building where heels clicked, voices lowered, and people moved as if every second already belonged to someone else. Grace tried not to let it get to her. She'd gotten the confirmation email just 2 days ago. Administrative Associate, HR Division. Her credentials had been thin, her experience overextended, but someone from corporate had responded to her application. She told herself that meant something. She had even managed to find a blazer without stains. The blouse underneath had a button missing, but the scarf covered it. Mostly, Mommy. Is this where the big people work? Lily asked, her voice bouncing across the quiet. Grace smiled down without answering, then crouched and whispered, Remember what I said. Okay, quiet voice, and stay close. They had only taken 3 steps toward the waiting area when the man behind the reception desk stood. He had sandy hair, a lapel pin shaped like a sailboat, and the expression of someone trained to smile without offering warmth. Ma'am, this area is reserved for guests with confirmed appointments, he said, eyeing the child. Grace straightened, her voice calm. I have one. 9:15. Grace Mitchell. She reached into her folder, pulling out the printed email and extending it toward him. The man glanced down at it briefly, then back at her. And the child. My daughter. I couldn't find Kara this morning. She'll sit quietly beside me. I'm sorry, he said, his smile faltering, but his tone unmoved. It's company policy. Guests with children aren't allowed on executive levels without prior authorization. Around them, conversation slowed. A man in a gray trench coat paused mid-coffee. A woman scrolling her phone lifted her eyes. Grace's fingers tensed around the folder. It's just an interview. The receptionist didn't reply. He didn't need to. The look was enough subtle, practiced, decisive. Grace felt herself shrink, just slightly. Mommy, Lily said again, a little louder now, tugging at her arm. Grace looked down, trying to silence her with a soft hush, but Lily was already turning, her eyes lighting up. Mommy, that's him. That's Daddy. Grace froze. Across the room, the tall glass doors of the East Conference wing slid open. Out stepped a man in a slate blue suit, crisp white shirt, and no tie. He had silver just beginning to claim the sides of his hair, and the unmistakable carriage of someone used to being followed, listened to, obeyed. His name, Andrew Callahan, was etched into the headlines Grace had read and into the plaque mounted outside the elevator to the top floor. He stopped walking. Grace could feel her chest tighten. It wasn't just the words Lily had said. It was the way the entire room reacted, eyes swinging from the little girl to the CEO, then back again, some in confusion, some in recognition. Time stretched. Andrew's gaze met Grace's. Not with anger, not even with surprise. Something else. Like hearing a tune you hadn't known you missed until the chorus hit. Lily, still pointing, repeated herself softer this time, as if affirming that's Daddy. Andrew took a step forward. Only one. His mouth parted slightly, as if words might come but hadn't found shape yet. The woman beside him, tall, blonde, wrapped in a green wool coat, leaned in. Is something wrong? He didn't answer. Grace knelt beside Lily, heart pounding. She whispered, "That's not your daddy, sweetheart." But the words came out thin, almost apologetic. She looked back up. Andrew hadn't moved. The receptionist cleared his throat, voice slightly quieter now. "Ma'am, if you'd like to step outside while we reschedule, she has an appointment." Another voice cut in. It was the assistant standing behind Andrew, holding a tablet, brows drawn. Her eyes flicked to the schedule, then back to Grace. "Mitchell, HR interview, 9:15. Should I cancel it?" Sir Andrew said nothing. Grace rose to her feet, her hand still tightly around her daughter's. The walls felt too white, the air too clean, the silence too sharp. She didn't speak to anyone, just turned toward the door, leading Lily with her. Behind her, she felt the weight of stairs, one pair more than the rest. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. Grace left the tower without speaking. She didn't glance back at the security desk or the curious glances trailing behind her. Her only focus was Lily, whose small fingers clutched hers tightly, unaware of the silence she had detonated in the lobby minutes earlier. Outside, the city moved without pause horns, footsteps, a low-hanging fog that softened the edges of buildings. Grace walked quickly down West Monroe Street toward the Adams Wabash station. Her shoes damp from rain the pavement hadn't fully absorbed. Lily skipped once, dragging her feet through a puddle and giggling. Grace didn't smile. Her mind spun in too many directions at once. What had she expected? That he'd remember Rebecca's face through a child's eyes, that he'd fall to his knees with recognition and beg for answers? Of course not. Andrew Callahan hadn't even blinked. At the platform, Grace knelt and wiped a few raindrops off Lily's cheeks. "You must never say that again," she said gently, but firmly. Lily frowned. "But he looked like I know." Grace interrupted, her voice softer now. "But he's not your father." "Lily, not in the way you think." The train rattled in, silver and loud. They boarded in silence, finding a seat near the back. Grace pulled Lily close and stared at her reflection in the fogged-up window. She hated herself a little for bringing Lily, for hoping something human might have surfaced in that marble lobby, for thinking the past could unravel with a name. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Grace retrieved the box she kept hidden in the closet behind the winter coats. Inside were letters Rebecca had written but never mailed, an old apartment key, and a photograph. Two college girls, arms around each other, smiling under a banner that read, "NYU Future Leaders Gala." But it wasn't them that Grace looked at. It was the man behind them, caught mid-laugh, wearing the same angular jaw and smile she had seen in the lobby that morning. Andrew Callahan. Rebecca had never said his name aloud. She had only called it a mistake. A moment. A night too complicated to explain. But Grace remembered her face the day Lily was born. How her hands trembled as she signed the birth certificate. How she whispered, "If something ever happens, promise me you'll raise her like your own." In his corner office on the 39th floor, Andrew Callahan stood with his back to the skyline. Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the glass, a grid of steel and movement. He held a coffee cup in his right hand, untouched since morning. His assistant had long since left for the day. He hadn't moved much since Grace Mitchell walked out of the lobby. At first, he'd dismissed it a misunderstanding, some overstep. But the girl, her voice, her eyes, there was something there, something he couldn't shake. He turned from the window and sat at his desk. On the monitor, he opened the company's interview tracking system. Grace Mitchell, applied for administrative associate, South Chicago address, associate degree, 7 years at a nonprofit before its closure. No direct reference, but her resume had been flagged by the internal screening system. He clicked her name again, then opened the staff database. He didn't know what he was looking for. A link, a reason, anything. Instead, he found himself murmuring to the empty room, "Rebecca Rivera." The name hit the air like a secret he hadn't spoken in years. Then he picked up the phone. "Erica," he said. When his assistant answered, "Pull everything we have on Grace Mitchell and check if she was ever referred by someone named Rebecca Rivera." On the other end of the line, a pause. "I'll get back to you." After hanging up, Andrew stared at the skyline again. But this time, it wasn't the city he saw. It was a girl's voice echoing across polished marble. "That's Daddy." Later that night, Grace sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, answering job board alerts she knew led nowhere. Her inbox pinged. She didn't recognize the address, but the subject line stopped her cold. "Interview update, Callahan Group." She clicked, "Dear Ms. Mitchell, we apologize for the earlier confusion. Your interview has been rescheduled. New time, 9:00 a.m. Location Executive Boardroom, floor 42. Please confirm your attendance." She stared at the screen. She didn't move for a long while. Then she closed the laptop and reached for the teapot, her fingers slightly trembling as she poured. Outside the apartment window, the L train rumbled past like a slow breath. She didn't know what they wanted, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. The elevator hummed as it climbed toward the 41st floor, smooth and silent like the building itself. Grace watched the red numbers light up one by one, her fingers curled around the strap of her purse. She had left Lily with Mrs. Paxton, the retired nurse who lived in the unit below hers, after a brief but grateful knock on the door that morning. "She'll be no trouble," Grace had whispered. "She loves puzzles." Now she stood alone, the air inside the elevator far too clean, too quiet. When the door slid open, a tall woman in a navy suit was waiting. "Ms. Mitchell, this way, please." Grace followed her through a glass corridor into a conference room that didn't look like a space where job interviews happened. The long mahogany table gleamed under soft overhead lighting. Leather chairs lined both sides, empty except one. At the far end, Andrew Callahan sat alone, a tablet in front of him, a closed notebook, and a bottle of untouched sparkling water. His posture was precise, almost architectural. He didn't stand to greet her. "Sit," he said, without warmth or cruelty, just instruction. She nodded and lowered herself into the nearest chair. It felt too deep, too soft. Her knees barely reached the edge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Andrew said, "Let's not waste time." Grace straightened. "Of course. You applied for the admin associate position, supporting HR and internal communications." "Yes." He scrolled on his tablet. "Your resume says you worked with the Southside Resource Center. 7 years, she said, until they lost funding last fall." He didn't respond to that. "Just tap the screen again. No formal referrals. I submitted directly through your site." He paused. "Then how did Lily know me?" Grace's breath caught. "I'm sorry. Your daughter. She called me Daddy." The room, already still, felt vacuum-sealed now. Grace blinked, slowly. "She's my daughter," she said, voice even, "but not by blood." Andrew leaned back slightly, his fingers pressed together, elbows on the armrest. "Then who's she was my best friend's child, Rebecca Rivera?" The name fell into the space between them like a dropped glass. Andrew blinked once. Grace watched him closely, searching for a flicker of recognition. If it was there, it didn't show. "She passed away 2 years ago," Grace continued. "Complications from a rare autoimmune condition. No known family. I was her health proxy, and the only emergency contact. I took Lily in." He didn't move. His eyes were focused, but unreadable. "So why did she call me that?" Grace hesitated. Her fingers tugged gently at the edge of her scarf. "Because she found something I thought I had hidden well." Andrew's eyes narrowed, just a little. "What a photo of you with Rebecca at NYU, some benefit event. You were smiling. She kept it like a keepsake. She said you looked like someone she should know." There was a silence so tight it could snap. Andrew exhaled slowly. "And you brought her with you." "I had no choice." He didn't challenge her. He just stared. Then he asked, quietly, "Is this a setup?" No. Her voice was clear. It's not. He nodded once, then looked down at the tablet again, though he wasn't reading it anymore. Grace sat still, her palms resting on her lap. Andrew finally looked up. There are procedures in place, hiring panels, background checks. I understand. This interview, he paused, is no longer an interview. She waited. It's something else. I don't know what yet. Grace stood. Then maybe we shouldn't waste any more of your time. But before she turned, he said, Don't leave. Not yet. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. He wasn't asking for her trust. He was asking for a moment longer. Outside, behind the thick windows. The city was waking, but inside that room, two people sat across from each other, bound not by employment or power, but by a name that neither of them had said aloud until now. She didn't say yes or no. She just stayed seated, quiet, waiting to see if something would change. The rain had stopped by the time Grace reached the corner of 51st and Indiana. The sidewalk was still slick, the gutters still humming. She stepped into the narrow entry of her apartment building, wiped her shoes on the mat, and climbed the stairs two at a time, inside her unit. Lily was asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket with the television humming a soft lullaby. Mrs. Paxton must have left already. Grace switched off the screen, kissed her daughter's forehead, and went to the bedroom. She opened the closet slowly. At the back, beneath a folded quilt and a shoebox of bills she hadn't paid yet, sat an old photo album. She hadn't looked through it in a year, maybe longer. Her fingers moved with care, almost reverence. Inside, pressed between two plastic sleeves, was the picture she'd carried through college, through jobs, through loss. It was taken at a fundraiser in Manhattan, sometime during their second year at NYU. Rebecca wore a champagne-colored dress, her hair swept to one side. She wasn't smiling at the camera. Her eyes were turned slightly left toward the man standing beside her. Andrew. He wasn't in focus. Someone had taken the shot hastily, or perhaps he'd simply moved at the last moment. But his outline was clear, tall, relaxed, one hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding a glass of wine, and his eyes unmistakably locked on Rebecca, like she'd said something he hadn't expected and didn't want to forget. Grace had asked her once, years ago, about that night. Rebecca had laughed, almost dismissively. It was one of those evenings, she'd said, a night when everything feels too loud and you dance with someone whose name you don't ask until later. I made the mistake of asking. That had been the end of the conversation. Grace slid the photo from its sleeve and held it in her lap. She could see it clearly now how Lily's eyes resembled his, not just in shape, but in the way they widened when she was unsure. Lily must have found this picture. Maybe during one of those weekends Grace worked late. Maybe while playing make-believe in the closet. Maybe she'd asked, and Grace hadn't answered fast enough. The door creaked slightly as the bedroom heater kicked on. Grace folded the photo and slipped it back into a paper envelope. She returned the album to its hiding place. Some truths were too heavy to leave lying around, across the city, in a loft above Michigan Avenue. Andrew sat at his kitchen counter. A decanter of whiskey, still sealed, sat unopened beside him. His laptop glowed softly, casting blue light across the marble. The screen displayed archived digital press clippings from 2011. NYU Young Leaders Gala. The image popped up, clearer than Grace's copy. Rebecca standing beneath a gold chandelier, hand resting lightly on her hip. Smile soft, but unreadable. Andrew remembered the tie he wore that night. Navy. The only one he owned that wasn't striped. He hadn't seen her again after that week. She had disappeared. Or maybe he had. The years after graduation blurred internships, mergers, boardrooms. Rebecca Rivera hadn't surfaced in any of them, until now. He clicked back to Grace Mitchell's application. Her file was thin but complete, her references solid. There was no reason she should have ended up in front of him unless someone had sent her. But why would anyone do that? What would she gain? He didn't believe in coincidence, not in his world, not in buildings with armed security and curated elevators. Yet here it was, a child calling him daddy, and a woman holding her ground like she knew more than she was willing to say. He reached for his phone. His fingers hovered above the screen, then retreated. There was no one to call who wouldn't have questions. No assistant could clarify what memory refused to supply. Instead, he opened his personal folder and searched the name again. Rebecca Rivera. Her obituary came up in the database. Died 2 years ago. Cause autoimmune complications. Survived by none listed. None. He closed the laptop. Back in Grace's apartment, the kettle began to hiss on the stove. She poured herself a cup of tea but didn't drink it. She sat by the window, watching the street below. Her mind wasn't on the interview anymore. It was on the strange stillness in Andrew's voice when he asked about Lily. Not angry, not skeptical, just still. Like the moment had pressed pause on a version of him he hadn't expected to meet again. In the quiet, Grace whispered to herself, "You should have told him. Becca, you should have at least left him a name." The clock ticked. Across the room, Lily stirred but didn't wake. Grace leaned back and closed her eyes. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew now why her hands had trembled when she brought Lily into that building, and somewhere in the dark. Andrew stared at the city lights, not remembering enough, but too much to forget. The morning air was sharper than the day before. Grace stood across from the revolving doors of Callahan Group Tower, her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The lobby shimmered behind glass, polished and busy, a world she still didn't feel permitted to enter. But she took one step forward, then another. There was no Lily this time, just her and the memory of yesterday's silence. Today's interview was with HR, floor 18, not 41. No private boardroom, no marble long table, no Andrew. This was where regular candidates went, people who didn't stir attention just by standing still. The receptionist nodded curtly this time, handed her a visitor's badge, and pointed to the elevator bank. Grace adjusted her scarf and stepped inside, her breath catching just slightly as the doors closed behind her. When she exited, a staff coordinator greeted her. "Room C," the woman said, "down the hall, on your left." Grace was halfway there when she heard laughter echoing around the corner. She slowed instinctively. Turning the bend, she saw them. Andrew stood near the window alcove, tall as ever, crisp in a black suit. Beside him, a woman in a winter-white Dior coat, blonde, poised, effortless, Charlotte Monroe. Grace recognized her from the magazines, the annual reports, the high society write-ups that showed up in checkout aisle tabloids, but also on the cover of Forbes. She was smiling just barely, and her eyes caught Grace's the moment she stepped into view. Charlotte leaned in slightly, speaking just loud enough. "She's pretty," she said, in a damaged way. Andrew didn't respond, or if he did, it was too quiet for Grace to hear. She didn't flinch. She kept walking, head high, shoes clicking firmly on the polished hallway. Her hands, however, curled tighter around the handle of her folder, not out of anger, out of the memory of Rebecca's voice. "Grace, if anything ever happens, don't let anyone talk about her like she was broken." Inside the interview room, 3 people sat at the table: HR manager, operations liaison, and a middle-aged man who introduced himself as the technical lead for internal support. Grace smiled, shook hands, and took the offered seat. The first few questions were procedural: her past work, the nonprofit closure, why she was applying here. She answered clearly, evenly, no embellishments. Then the man from operations asked, "Can you tell us about a time you solved a problem that wasn't yours to solve?" Grace paused. Her hands rested still on her lap. "I can," she said. "It was the night Rebecca died. The room went still. She was my best friend. She had no family, no insurance, and was in critical condition after an autoimmune flare postpartum." Grace's voice didn't waver. The hospital needed a guardian's signature to proceed with emergency treatment. There was no one else. So I signed. "You weren't her legal guardian." Someone asked. "No," Grace said, "but I told them I was—" Silence again, not judging, just the kind that absorbs something weighty and doesn't rush to fill it. "What happened?" the HR manager asked quietly. "She lived through the night," Grace answered, "long enough to name her daughter, then she was gone." No one spoke for a beat. Grace folded her hands together. "I wasn't a hero. I just did what someone had to do," in a hallway, just beyond the glass divider. Andrew had been walking past when he caught her voice. He didn't intend to stop, but something in her tone made him pause. He leaned against the wall just out of sight, listening. He had only known the surface of this woman, a resume, a child's voice. But now, hearing what she had done without gain, without obligation, something inside him shifted. Not in guilt, not yet, but in recognition. This wasn't someone trying to stir scandal. This was someone who had carried weight no one assigned her, and done it without expecting thanks. Grace exited the room quietly 20 minutes later, her steps steady, face calm. Andrew was still by the far wall. He started to lift his hand as she walked by. A word nearly formed, but then his hand dropped. She turned her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. She didn't stop walking. He didn't follow. And somehow, that silence between them spoke louder than anything either could have said. The offer came on a quiet Friday morning, an email stamped with the signature of Human Resources and the seal of Callahan Group. Grace read it twice before she believed it. It wasn't a glamorous role, not a managerial position, but it was full-time, with benefits, and steady enough to stop the late-night worry about rent or Lily's next dental appointment. The title read, Internal Documentation Associate. The desk would be on the 17th floor. Her first day started with an early alarm, a rushed breakfast of toast and jam, and a quick walk to drop Lily off with Mrs. Paxton by 8:45. Grace stood again in front of the same tower that had once asked her to leave its lobby. But now she had a badge. Her desk sat in a quiet corridor near legal. The windows didn't reach the floor like they did upstairs, but there was soft light, clean air, and a small framed quote about clarity on the wall. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Dina, handed her a stack of internal brand strategy reports. "Some of these are outdated," Dina explained. "We're clearing out archives, keep anything marked with client-side initials, and recycle the rest." Grace nodded and got to work. By mid-morning, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting papers into labeled piles. The documents smelled faintly of toner and lemon polish. One folder unmarked, and heavier than the rest, slipped from her lap and spilled open. Loose sheets slid across the floor. She bent to gather them, and something fluttered out a photograph, wedged between two pages. Grace froze. The image had the glossy sheen of a professional shot, likely from a press package, in it. Andrew stood in a navy tuxedo beneath soft chandelier light. Next to him, in a floor-length emerald gown, was Rebecca. Rebecca, smiling, her hair swept to one side, a wine glass in her hand. But it wasn't their smiles or the lighting that stopped Grace cold. It was the placement of Rebecca's left hand, resting, almost instinctively, over the subtle curve of her belly. Pregnant. Grace stared at the photo, pulse thudding in her ears. This wasn't an ordinary party shot. It had been taken months before Rebecca showed obvious signs. And Andrew, he looked at her like he already knew. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe that was the whole point. Grace placed the photograph inside a plain white envelope she pulled from her drawer. She didn't trust herself to look at it longer. She spent the next few hours filing without thinking. Her hands moved, but her mind ran backward through memories of hospital visits, of Rebecca growing quieter in her last months, of the way Lily had clutched that old photograph like a talisman. And now here she was, inside the very building that once shut her out, holding proof of a truth buried under silence. At lunch, she walked to the staff cafeteria on the 16th floor. It was quieter than expected. Most employees ordered out or stayed at their desks. She moved toward the coffee station, pouring herself a cup, when she noticed him. Andrew sat at a table near the far wall, facing the windows. No phone, no laptop, just a paper cup in front of him, untouched. His suit jacket was off, his sleeves rolled. He saw her. Their eyes met, and for a second, Neither moved. Then he raised a hand slightly. "Do you have a minute?" Grace walked over, still clutching the envelope. She didn't sit. Instead, she held it out to him. "You left this behind," she said. He took it. His brows furrowed, opening the flap. He slid the photograph into view. The moment it registered, his shoulders dropped slightly. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I swear." Grace studied his face, not the powerful man she had seen on magazine covers, but the man across from her now, no armor, no boardroom edge. She didn't answer. He looked back down at the photo, as if it held a language he couldn't translate. "I thought she disappeared," he murmured. "We weren't anything serious. One weekend. Then nothing." Grace's voice came low. "She wasn't trying to trap you. She just didn't want to complicate things. I would have done something. I could have. But you didn't," she interrupted. "Not unkindly. Just honest." He nodded, slowly, still holding the picture. Grace turned to go, but paused. "She didn't want pity," she said. "That's why she never told you." And with that, she walked away. She didn't look back. But he knew something had changed. The envelope came on a Thursday, heavy cream stock, her name printed in bold serif, the Callahan Group seal embossed in gold. Inside was an invitation, elegant, unmistakable. "You are cordially invited to the 50th anniversary gala of Callahan Group, Saturday, 7:00 p.m., Waldorf Astoria, Chicago. Accompanied guests, welcome." Grace stared at it for a full minute before setting it on the counter. She wasn't sure if it was a mistake. There was no note, no signature, just her name, perfectly spelled, as if it had always belonged there. That night, Lily spotted the card. "What's this, an invitation?" Grace said. "A company event." Lily's eyes widened. She ran to the old stack of magazines Grace kept by the window, flipping through until she stopped at a photo of a red carpet lookbook. "Can I wear something like this if we go?" Grace smiled faintly, brushing a hand through her daughter's curls. "If we go," she echoed. Saturday evening came fast. Grace wore a navy blue dress borrowed from a neighbor and heels she hadn't touched since Rebecca's funeral. Lily's dress was second-hand lavender with a satin ribbon, but the way she twirled in it made it look new. Grace braided her daughter's hair with careful fingers, then tied a ribbon at the end. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about showing up for the child who asked if they belonged. The Waldorf Astoria shimmered with chandeliers and strings of soft jazz. Grace held Lily's hand tightly as they walked through the marbled lobby, past the floral arrangements and trays of hors d'oeuvres. Their presence shifted the room's rhythm. People noticed. Not rudely, not loudly, but unmistakably. Some whispered, others simply stared. Charlotte Monroe approached like someone who had already circled the room twice. Her green gown caught the light in every right place, her heels silent as she walked. She smiled the way pageant winners do, deliberate and camera-ready. "You must be the guest Andrew insisted on inviting," she said. Not a question, not warm, either. Grace met her gaze, steady, yes. "And this is Lily." Charlotte's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to Grace. "She's lovely. She is." Then Charlotte leaned in, the champagne in her hand, catching a glint of gold. "Enjoy the evening," she said with a tone that didn't quite mean it, and slipped away like a whisper behind a locked door. Later, while guests toasted to legacy and future, Grace stood near the exit, preparing to leave. Lily was getting tired, her excitement dimmed into small yawns. Grace reached for their coats when a familiar voice cut through the hum. "Don't go yet." Andrew stood behind her, no jacket, his tie loosened. "I need to show you something." He led her up a quiet staircase to the mezzanine library. The room was dim, lined with dark wood and portraits of stern men in darker suits, old money, framed in oil. Andrew stopped in front of one particular portrait, That's my grandfather. He said, David Callahan. He built all of this. Every floor, every policy, every silence. Grace looked at the painting. The man's eyes were pale, his expression unreadable. He also buried a lot. Andrew continued. Secrets, affairs, contracts he tore up, and people he erased. No one ever challenged him. My father didn't. I didn't. Not until now. He turned to her. I don't want to inherit his silence. Grace studied him. In this moment, there was no billion-dollar boardroom, no towering skyline behind him. Just a man, unguarded, grappling with the shape of what had been passed down. Then don't be silent, she said. And before he could respond, she turned and walked out, her heels soft on the carpet, her daughter waiting at the foot of the stairs. It had been a week since the gala, but the words Grace carried from the mezzanine library still pressed at the back of her chest, like a bruise not yet healed. She returned to her routine, sorting documents, scanning drafts, logging revisions, yet nothing quite returned to the way it had been before. Something had tilted in the center, and it tilted further when Dina stopped by her desk that morning, holding a manila folder labeled Executive Portfolio Revisions. Can you run this up to the 42nd floor boardroom suite? She said. Grace blinked. Executive. They're in meetings, but they want this today. It's only delivery. Grace nodded, tucked the folder under her arm, and pressed the elevator button with a steady hand. But as the numbers climbed, the memory returned of being asked to leave the lobby, of Lily's voice calling Daddy, and the silence that followed like a held breath across marble floors. When the elevator doors opened, Grace stepped into a world of polished wood and glass walls. The air smelled faintly of citrus and leather. She walked down the corridor, heels muffled on the carpet, and paused just outside the open doors of a lounge area adjacent to the boardroom. Charlotte Monroe stood in profile, laughing politely at something said by a woman seated beside her. The woman wore a soft gray dress and pearl earrings. Eleanor Callahan. Her silver hair was pulled into a bun, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. This was the matriarch Grace had only heard of until now, the majority shareholder, the quiet iron hand behind Andrew's ascension. As Grace stepped in to set the folder on the credenza, Eleanor's eyes moved to her and landed there with cool precision. We don't usually allow admin staff to bring children to work, Eleanor said. Her voice measured, not sharp, just shaped for dismissal. Before Grace could respond, a new voice interrupted. Then make an exception. For both of them. Andrew had entered without warning, hands in his pockets, gaze direct. He walked past Charlotte, past his mother, and stood beside Grace. She's here on company business, he said, and Lily's here because the childcare center on 43rd closed early. That's all. There was a pause, just long enough for the tension to thread itself between them. Charlotte spoke next, smile frozen. I didn't realize Lily was in the building. She's just down the hall, coloring in the lounge. Andrew replied without shifting his gaze. Grace wanted to shrink away, to finish the task and leave. But at that moment, Lily appeared, barefoot and bright, a sheet of paper in her hand. She ran to Grace and held up her drawing with pride. Mommy, I finished it. Grace crouched beside her. Can I see? Lily turned the paper around. It was a crayon family portrait, simple and sweet. A woman with brown hair, a small girl with pigtails, and a tall man in glasses standing beside them. Everyone was holding hands. Charlotte let out a quiet exhale. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her eyes fixed on the man in the picture. Is that supposed to be me? Andrew asked gently, crouching beside them. Lily nodded. You look like him. He smiled, touched her head softly. Thank you. Eleanor stepped closer and took the picture from Grace's hand without asking. She studied it in silence, tracing the lines with her gaze. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but pointed. Rebecca Rivera. Wasn't she that intern from NYU years ago? Grace's heart skipped. Andrew stood slowly. She was, he said. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply looked again at the drawing, then handed it back. Grace rose, holding Lily's hand tighter than before. No one said anything more, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a question, suspended in the air, and waiting. Andrew sat alone in his office late into the evening, the city lights painting silent reflections across the windows. On his desk, a manila folder lay open, archived intern records from 2016. He had requested them quietly, bypassing the usual channels. No one asked why the CEO was combing through old summer intern files, and no one dared interrupt. Rebecca Rivera. Her name appeared fourth on the list. NYU, communications major, 3-month placement under the Public Affairs Division, no HR notes beyond standard evaluation. Polite, quiet, reliable. There were no flagged issues, no follow-up interactions logged, no record of extended correspondence, just a signature on an exit form, and then blank space. Andrew leaned back in his chair. He didn't remember everything. That was the worst part. He recalled a gala, one of many, the kind with bottomless champagne and too many introductions. He remembered dancing with a woman who laughed softly and didn't stay long. Her name hadn't stayed either, until now. Meanwhile, in a quieter part of the city, Grace sat at the kitchen table of their Hyde Park apartment, sifting through a shoebox of letters Rebecca had left behind. Most were scrawled during her hospital stays, fragments of motherhood, fear, and quiet love. Toward the bottom, one envelope hadn't been opened before. It was addressed simply, "If anything happens." The handwriting inside trembled. "If I don't make it, please tell Andrew. He doesn't know. He doesn't need to feel guilty." I chose silence. But maybe someday, he should see her smile. Grace folded the paper slowly, her hands still. She closed her eyes and let the weight of the words settle. That afternoon, she'd received a call from Lily's school. The front office staff explained, with some confusion, that Lily's tuition had been paid in full for the next year. "By whom?" Grace asked. "He didn't leave a name," the woman replied. "Only a short message. It said, 'For Rebecca's daughter.'" Grace left the building in silence, holding the phone tighter than needed. She didn't need a name. The gesture was signature enough. That evening, she texted Andrew a single line. "If you want to talk, meet me at the lake." The sun was setting when he arrived. He found her sitting alone on a bench that faced Lake Michigan, a scarf wrapped around her shoulders against the breeze. The water moved without urgency, the waves muted and gentle. He sat beside her, hands folded between his knees. Neither spoke at first. It wasn't a silence that demanded to be broken. It was the kind that allowed room for truth. Finally, Grace spoke. Her voice was quiet, her eyes forward. "She didn't blame you," she said, "but I did." For a long time, Andrew nodded slowly, still not looking at her. "I deserved it." "No," Grace said. "You deserve to know. That's different." He let the words sit there, let them sting and settle. "I don't need to be forgiven," he said after a while. "I just need a place to begin." The streetlights flicked on behind them, casting soft glows across the path. They sat like that for a long time, two people with no scripts left to read from, no defenses left to lean on. There was still distance, still pain. But something had changed in how they held it. Together. They watched the lake shimmer beneath the first stars. He didn't reach for her hand. She didn't move away. They just stayed. And it was enough for now. It was a gray Chicago morning, the kind that felt like the city hadn't fully woken up yet. The sky hung low, and the sidewalk still held the damp sheen of last night's rain. Grace tightened Lily's scarf as they reached the school gate, then paused when she noticed the black SUV idling at the curb. Not just any SUV, Andrew's. He stepped out as if he had been waiting there a while. His coat collar was turned up, and in his hand, a small bento box with a sticker of a cartoon sun on the lid. He didn't try to smile, just raised the box slightly, almost sheepishly. "I thought she might like this for lunch," he said. Then, softer, "Can I walk her in?" Grace hesitated. Her eyes moved from his to Lily's, who had already spotted him and was waving with both hands. There was no hiding the joy in her voice. "Mommy, look." He remembered the sunshine box. Grace nodded. The smallest movement, barely enough to be seen. She stepped aside, inside the schoolyard. Lily ran ahead while Andrew knelt beside her to retie a loose shoelace. Grace stood behind, watching not just what he did, but how he did it. No rush, no pretense. Just a man tying a little girl's shoes, like he'd been doing it for years. That moment settled into her like a weight, warm and confusing. That evening, on the other side of the city, the Callahan estate was quiet, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Eleanor Callahan sat at the head of the long oak table in the private conference room, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Andrew sat across from her. No assistants, no advisors. "Are you trying to turn a moment of poor judgment into a legacy?" she asked, voice calm but heavy. Andrew didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and placed an envelope on the table. DNA test results. He didn't explain. Just let the truth sit there, bare and undeniable. "She's mine," he said. "Not by accident, not by regret, just mine." Eleanor didn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, "Do you understand what this means for the family name?" Andrew looked at her, not defiant, not apologetic, just steady. "I think it's about time we let the name mean something honest." While that conversation played out in silence, Grace was home preparing dinner when she noticed something unusual wedged between the front door and the frame. A thick envelope, no return address. Inside, neatly arranged, were pages of insurance documentation, medical coverage for Rebecca Rivera, reissued in 2018. The name of the financial sponsor was printed at the top, Charlotte Monroe Holdings. The paper trembled slightly in Grace's hand. Her breath caught. The woman who had stood beside Andrew, confident and composed, had known all along, not just about Rebecca, but about Lily. Grace sank into the couch, the envelope still open beside her. The past wasn't just resurfacing, it had never truly gone. Her phone was within reach. She picked it up, thumb hovering over Andrew's name in her contacts. Her finger touched the screen, but she didn't press. She looked out the window instead, at the city lit up in small squares of light, at the shadows in between. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what she wanted him to say. It was past noon when Grace stepped through the glass doors of the Callahan group, her breath slightly unsteady but her gaze clear. She didn't have an appointment, didn't check in at reception, but the moment she appeared in the lobby, Andrew was already walking toward her. No hesitation, no performance, just a quiet recognition, like he had been expecting her. They said nothing on the elevator ride. At the lower executive level, he led her into a smaller meeting room, no windows, just soft lighting and two chairs opposite a polished wood table, the kind of room designed for conversations that didn't belong on record. Grace sat first. She didn't wait. Charlotte financially sponsored Rebecca's health insurance. "It's in the documents you left on my door." "Were you aware?" Andrew didn't flinch. He just nodded, slowly. "I found out last night." His voice didn't carry emotion, but something in his eyes looked heavier than it did days ago. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and began to speak not like a CEO, but like a man trying to piece together something he should have seen sooner. "She reached out to Charlotte once," he said, "back in 2017, asked for help funding a student-led community initiative. Charlotte said yes, formally, but from then on, she followed every update, every application, quietly, not out of kindness." Grace folded her arms across her chest. She was jealous. Andrew looked up. "Of Rebecca?" "No," Grace replied. "Of someone you never even realized you were watching?" He didn't argue, just exhaled, slow and thin. Then he leaned back, pressing a palm against his forehead. "I'm marrying someone I've been wrong about for years," he said, more to himself than to her, "and I've known that truth far longer than I've admitted." The silence after that felt thicker than the room itself. Grace looked down at her hands, nails still bitten short from stress. She didn't want to ask what came next, didn't want to define it, or explain it. Instead, she said what had been sitting under her tongue since Rebecca died. I don't know if I have it in me anymore. To trust, to hope, to believe someone means what they say. It wasn't a confession. It was a wound. Andrew didn't rush to reassure her. He didn't try to touch her or meet her pain with promises. He just sat still. Then, quietly, "Then let me start with this. I won't leave." Grace didn't answer, but her eyes met his, just long enough for something unspoken to land between them. The morning broke over Chicago in that colorless way only November manages, sky low, clouds thick, and every breath on the street a ghost. Grace didn't dress for battle. She wore a white shirt that still smelled faintly of the fabric softener she could afford, and her only pair of clean jeans, her brown leather satchel, scuffed at the corners, was slung across her body. It wasn't armor. It was just what she had. Outside the River Point building, press vans lined the curb in a quiet row, like vultures waiting for movement. But oddly, no one called her name, no flashes, no questions. She realized, with a twinge of breathlessness, that no one knew she would be here. Inside, the lobby was marble and silence. The elevator to the 12th floor opened with a hushed tone. A young assistant led her down a hallway flanked by abstract art and doors too heavy to push without both hands. At the end, the hearing chamber, oak panels, a long crescent table of board members, and just enough light to keep people honest. She entered without pause. The moment her foot touched the stone floor, chairs shifted, heads turned. There were no gasps, no whispers, just the stillness that follows when something unplanned walks into a room of control. Charlotte was already seated, her back straight, face flawless. Andrew stood at the far end, alone. His tie was loose, as if he'd pulled it once in frustration, but hadn't bothered to fix it. He saw Grace enter. His face didn't change, but his hands folded in front of him tightened slightly. The moderator announced her as a witness to prior financial inconsistencies connected to Miss Monroe's private accounts. But that wasn't why she was here. Everyone in the room felt that, even if no one said it. They asked her to state her name. She did, then her occupation, then her connection to the Callahan Group. "I'm not connected to the company," she said clearly. "I'm just the woman who raised Rebecca Rivera's daughter." That was when the whispers started. Charlotte's mouth twitched. She didn't speak. Andrew stood. The chair behind him scraped against the wood. He adjusted nothing. Didn't clear his throat. Didn't shuffle his notes. "I've made mistakes," he began, voice lower than expected but firm. "Professional ones, personal ones. But hiding my daughter, my family, is not going to be one of them." Gasps came now. Someone dropped a pen. He turned to the board. "Ms. Monroe has acted on personal interests under the guise of corporate concern. I supported it for too long. That ends today. I'm recommending her immediate removal as brand strategist and future stakeholder." Charlotte's jaw clenched, but she didn't interrupt. Not today. Grace didn't sit. She hadn't been asked to speak further. But somehow, her presence in the room had done what no strategy had managed. Later, as minutes were filed and motions recorded, a legal assistant, tired-eyed and overworked, typed the hearing summary. One small error, unnoticed until hours later in the line where Lily was mentioned. Her name had been written as Lily Callahan. No one corrected it. The knock came before sunrise. Grace had just zipped Lily's coat and was brushing crumbs from the kitchen counter when it echoed again, steady, unhurried. She opened the door, expecting the mailman, or maybe Mrs. Kagan downstairs, always misdelivering something. Instead, it was Andrew. He wore a long navy coat, unbuttoned, with the wind catching at the hem. In his hands, a small white pastry box from Dinkle's, tied with red string. He didn't speak, just looked at her with a stillness that said he'd been standing there longer than the knock suggested. Then Lily appeared behind her, hopping on one foot as she fixed her boot. "Daddy," she said, beaming. "Are we going to the museum today?" Grace froze. The words sliced the air like church bells in a cemetery. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. Andrew blinked, slowly. His hands didn't move. His breath caught just slightly. But when he looked at Grace, it wasn't panic or guilt. It was something closer to awe, like someone had just spoken aloud a truth he'd buried so deep. He'd almost convinced himself it wasn't his. They didn't say yes, didn't make a plan. They just went. At the Museum of Science and Industry. Grace walked between them. Lily ran ahead in spurts, circling back only to tug Andrew's hand, pull his sleeve, point to a solar display. He didn't let go. Even when she wasn't talking, she held on. And so did he. They shared lunch in the Atrium Cafe. Grace watched them from across the table, Lily drawing on a kid's placemat. Andrew watching her like he didn't know how the world outside this table had ever mattered. She smiled once, not for him, just for the moment. At the end, Lily held up her drawing. 3 stick figures, a girl in pink, a woman with long hair, a man with glasses. All 3 held hands. At the top, in blocky letters, my real family. Back at Callahan Group that afternoon, Andrew sat in the executive lounge waiting for the internal brand council to assemble. He wasn't wearing his usual suit jacket, no tie, just a quiet confidence and rolled sleeves. One shareholder leaned across the table, voice measured but cautious. "Mr. Callahan, do you intend to address the situation with the press? The rumors." The child Andrew didn't blink, didn't clear his throat or stall with legalese. "I already did," he said. "She called me daddy this morning." That was it. No strategy, no PR framing. Just a man stating a fact that had already redefined his entire life. After the meeting adjourned, Andrew returned to his office. Lily's drawing sat on his desk. He hadn't put it there, but didn't move it either, behind a panel of tinted glass in the hallway. Charlotte stood watching. She didn't step inside. Her expression didn't shift, but her hands curled tighter around her phone. She typed with one thumb, just one line. "She's playing this well. I warned you." The invitation had arrived in an envelope so thick it might have carried the weight of a verdict. Hand-delivered. No note. Just a return address stamped discreetly on the flap, Callahan Estate, Winnetka. Grace held it for hours before she said anything. When she finally did, it was to Lily. "We've been invited to dinner," she said softly, brushing her daughter's hair back. "It's important." That Friday, they took the Metro North. The sky over Chicago had turned a soft charcoal by the time they reached the suburbs. Trees lined the wide streets like watchful sentries. The Callahan Estate appeared at the end of a curved drive, white columns, stone steps, a roofline that seemed to stare down at them. Andrew met them at the entrance. No suit tonight, just a blazer and an open collar. His eyes found Lily first, and his voice was gentle when he said, "Thanks for coming." Inside, everything was polished, cold, and quiet. The kind of quiet where voices echoed, and forks weren't meant to clatter. Dinner was set in the formal dining room. The chandelier above them didn't flicker. It glowed steady like a judge's stare. Grace sat across from Eleanor Callahan, who looked every bit the matriarch posture carved from pride, eyes lined with decades of decisions. Charlotte sat beside her, in a muted navy dress, no jewelry but a thin chain at her wrist. She didn't speak, but her silence pressed like another presence in the room. Soup, then salad, then entree. Everything served by staff who moved soundlessly. It wasn't until the main course that Eleanor finally spoke. "I need clarity," she said, setting down her fork with exact precision. "I need proof. If this child is a Callahan, she'll need more than drawings and stories." Grace reached into her bag, slowly, pulled out a sealed manila folder and slid it across the table. Inside, copies of the DNA results, the kind that didn't leave room for doubt. "I didn't come here to beg," Grace said, voice calm but steady. "We don't want a title. We want a life. A normal one." For a moment, no one moved. Then Andrew reached beneath the table and found her hand. His grip was firm, not asking, not leading, just standing with... Charlotte rose from her seat with a quiet grace that felt rehearsed. "He's making a mistake," she said flatly, "and it will cost him everything." Andrew didn't flinch. He looked straight at her. Then I'll build everything again. Without you. The room fell into a silence that was no longer polite. It was brittle. Eleanor didn't look at either of them. She opened the folder, eyes scanning each page. Then she closed it, neatly, no reaction on her face. She stood, nodded once to no one, and left the room without a word. Charlotte's heels clicked once on the marble floor before she followed. The sound echoed like the door of a vault being sealed shut. Andrew exhaled slowly. His hand was still in hers. Across the table, Lily looked up from her untouched dessert and whispered, "Can we go home now?" The Callahan Foundation conference room hadn't seen this many cameras since the firm's IPO. Reporters squeezed shoulder to shoulder in the back rows. Photographers camped near the side aisles, flashes already cocked. Outside, news vans lined both sides of Michigan Avenue. The leak had done its job. The rumors were wildfire now. Andrew Callahan, heir to a billion-dollar brand, had canceled his engagement, appeared publicly with a child, and refused to comment. Until today. The podium stood under the Callahan crest. No branded backdrop. No carefully scripted introduction. Just a manila folder resting on a table and a single glass of water. Grace sat in the front row. Her fingers were laced tightly with lilies, knuckles pale. She wore a simple dress. Her posture straight but still Lily, in a cardigan, one size too big, swung her legs gently above the floor, unaware she was sitting in the center of a storm. Then Andrew entered. He wasn't flanked by attorneys. No PR chief, no assistant. Just him, sleeves rolled. A half-second pause before he took the microphone. The room went silent like someone had pulled the plug on the city outside. "I didn't know," he said, voice clear but low. "But now that I do, I won't walk away." No papers in his hand, no speech, just a story. He spoke of Rebecca, how they'd met during a fundraiser years ago, how she'd left without a word, how he never asked why. "I was too consumed with building a name," he said, eyes steady on the crowd, too proud to look behind me. He looked at Lily. She smiled, gave a small wave. The room shifted. I found out months ago, through a drawing, through a stranger's courage, through the silence of someone who never asked for anything, but gave everything. He paused. His breath caught just slightly before he added, "Family is not about blood. It's about who you show up for every day, without excuse." Cameras clicked, but no one moved, not even the shareholders in the back who'd come expecting scandal. Andrew glanced briefly toward the side door. Charlotte wasn't there, but the reporters' phones vibrated almost in unison. A new headline, a leaked clip, Charlotte's voice, icy and unmistakable. "She's playing this well. I warned you." Gasps spread in whispers. Screens lit up with quotes and instant analysis. But Andrew didn't flinch. Then came the shift. A figure walked onto the stage from the far wing. Eleanor Callahan. Her heels clicked with the grace of someone used to walking into rooms last and leaving them changed. She wore gray, minimal makeup. Her presence alone silenced even the click of camera shutters. She said nothing at first, just placed her hand gently on Andrew's shoulder. Her face didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. Then she turned to the press. "This is my granddaughter," she said, eyes steady. "Any questions?" It wasn't volume that broke the room open. It was weight, a full second of silence, then applause raw, rising, uncontrolled. Not for branding, not for legacy, but for truth. The late afternoon sun melted over the trees in Jackson Park, spreading long shadows across the walking paths. The lake caught the light like glass. Grace sat on a bench near the edge of the playground, shoes kicked off in the grass. Her eyes followed Lily, who was crouched low, drawing with a twig in the dust, her entire body focused, tongue slightly out, as if the world depended on every line. Behind them, footsteps slowed, not rushed, not cautious, just present. Andrew, no driver, no coat, no leather folder tucked under his arm, just a paper bag from a neighborhood bakery, and clothes that looked lived in rather than styled. Grace didn't stand. He didn't say hello. Instead, he lowered himself onto the bench beside her, opened the bag, and placed a small tin of cookies between them. Oatmeal raisin, Rebecca's favorite. She used to bake them in winter. Grace hadn't tasted them in years. He didn't try to make a speech. He didn't bring papers or promises. "I've had houses," he said quietly. "Apartments with views. Condos they called dream listings. But I've never drawn a home in the dirt with stick figures. Until I saw Lily do it." She glanced toward her daughter. The little girl had etched 3 people in front of a square with a chimney. 2 tall ones, 1 smaller, all holding hands. "I never thought I'd come back here," Grace said. "Not to this city, not to this space where things fall apart." Andrew's hands were still. He didn't try to touch hers, just opened his palm. In it lay a silver ring plain, worn smooth. No gem, no inscription. "For days without press," he said. "Without pressure. Without someone asking what this means. I want something that doesn't need explaining." Grace stared at the ring, not for its shape, but for the quiet weight it held. Not a proposal, a presence. Before she could answer, Lily ran up, cheeks flushed. "Look what I found," she chirped, holding a folded piece of paper. Grace recognized the handwriting before she even touched it. Rebecca. The letter was short, faded by time, and tucked deep in a notebook Lily had been doodling in for weeks. It had never been mailed, but the ink hadn't blurred. "If Grace is reading this," it began. Then someone stayed. "I don't know who you are, but thank you for loving her the way I knew someone would. Not the loud kind of love, just the kind that shows up." Grace closed her eyes. A breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwoods through the park. She opened them and looked at Andrew, not for reassurance, not for apology, but for truth. "We don't need to look perfect," she whispered. "We just need to keep choosing each other." Andrew didn't smile. He just nodded once, like a vow made with breath instead of words. And as Lily curled up beside them, laying her head on Grace's lap and her feet across Andrew's knees, none of them said anything more. They didn't need to. The old maple tree in Jackson Park still stands, its branches casting long, quiet shadows across the grass. On Sundays, you might see 3 silhouettes beneath it, drawing, talking, doing nothing special at all. But sometimes, the most ordinary spaces hold the most extraordinary peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because someone chose to stay when they could have left. And maybe in a world that moves too fast. That's the rarest kind of courage left.